Imagine a hardened military unit, armed with heavy machine guns, deployed to defend the homeland against a massive invading force. They fired thousands of rounds, expecting an easy victory, only to find their enemy was faster, cunning, and nearly invincible. It sounds like science fiction, but in 1932, this was the bizarre reality for soldiers facing Australia's most embarrassing opponent, the emu. Section 1. The broken promise of the soldier settlers. To understand why a modern government would eventually authorize a military strike against a flock of flightless birds, you first have to understand the men who asked for the bullets. We have to go back to the years immediately following the Great War. It's 1919. The guns on the Western Front have finally fallen silent, and thousands of Australian veterans, the ANZA CSR, returning home. These were men who had survived the horrors of Gallipoli and the mud of the Somme. They were hardened, traumatized, and looking for a way to reintegrate into a society that didn't quite know what to do with them. The Australian government, in an attempt to reward their service and open up the vast interior of the continent, launched what was called the Soldier Settlement Scheme. The pitch was simple, almost romantic. Turn your swords into plowshares. The government allocated parcels of land in the remote, scrubby margins of Western Australia, specifically in the Campion and Walgoolan districts, and told these veterans to grow wheat. It was supposed to be a land fit for heroes. But have you ever stopped to consider what happens when you give marginal, semi-arid land to men who are physically exhausted and mentally scarred? The reality was brutal. This wasn't the lush farmland of England or the fertile coasts of New South Wales. This was the edge of the outback. The soil was sandy, the rainfall was unreliable, and the isolation was crushing. These veterans weren't just farmers, they were pioneers on a frontier that didn't want to be tamed. They spent the entire 1920s clearing the scrub by hand, fencing off vast paddocks, and battling the harsh Australian elements. For a decade, they struggled. They poured their pensions and their sweat into the red dust, trying to coax a living out of the ground. By the late 20s, they had barely managed to establish a foothold. They were operating on razor-thin margins, banking everything on the promise of government subsidies and the hope of a good harvest. They had survived the war, and they were surviving the peace, but only just. There is a specific kind of resilience forged in war, a gritty determination to hold the line no matter what. These men had that in spades, but they were about to face a convergence of catastrophes that no amount of trench discipline could prepare them for. They thought the hardest battles were behind them, that the enemy was a distant memory across the ocean. They had no idea that the real enemy was already massing on the horizon, waiting for the fences to break. Would you have stayed? Faced with the dust, the heat, and the endless labor, most would have walked away. But these men were soldiers. They were dug in, and just as they were preparing to harvest the crop that would finally pay off their debts, the world economy collapsed, and nature turned against them. Section 2. The Perfect Storm. Depression, Drought, and Migration. The year is 1929. Across the ocean, ticker tape is raining down on the streets of New York, signaling the catastrophic collapse of Wall Street. But in the dusty wheat belts of Western Australia, the impact is felt, not in stocks and bonds, but in the price of a bushel of wheat. Overnight, the global market evaporated. The soldier settlers were suddenly farming a crop that cost more to grow than it was worth to sell. They were staring into the abyss of bankruptcy. And here is where the story takes a tragic turn. Instead of telling them to stop, the Australian government, desperate to boost exports, issued a frantic directive: grow more wheat. They promised subsidies. They promised a guaranteed price. They told the veterans to double their efforts, to clear even more land, trusting their commanders just as they had in the trenches. The settlers obeyed. They expanded their fields, removed the native scrub, and planted the largest harvest in the region's history. But the subsidies never came. The government reneged on its promise. By 1932, these farmers were destitute, betrayed, and physically broken. And then, the horizon began to move. It started as a low rumble, a cloud of dust rising in the interior. It wasn't a storm, it was a migration. You see, the emu is an incredibly adaptive creature. For thousands of years, their survival strategy has been simple. When the inland waterholes dry up during a drought, move toward the coast. In late 1932, an intense heat wave struck the interior. Following ancient instinct, 20,000 emus began to march west. But this time, something was different. In previous centuries, the emus would have encountered dense, difficult scrubland on their way to the ocean. But the soldier settlers had spent 10 years clearing that very path. They had removed the trees. They had planted nice, soft, edible wheat. And most importantly, they had built systems of water troughs for livestock. Do you see the irony? The settlers had inadvertently created a 5-star resort for the very creatures that would destroy them. To an emu, the Campion district wasn't a farm, it was an oasis. They arrived in a wave of feathers and beaks. 20,000 birds descended on the wheat fields. They didn't just eat the crop, they trampled it. They broke the fences, which allowed rabbits and other pests to pour in and finish off whatever was left. The devastation was absolute. Farmers watched helplessly as their livelihood, the very wheat the government had ordered them to grow, was consumed by a prehistoric-looking flood. This wasn't just a pest problem, it was an invasion. And when a soldier is invaded, he doesn't call an exterminator, he calls the army. The farmers held an emergency meeting. They didn't want poison, and they didn't want traps. They sent a delegation to the Minister of Defense, Sir George Pearce, with a very specific request. They wanted machine guns. And in one of the strangest decisions in political history, the minister said yes. Section 3. A military solution to an ecological problem. It is hard to overstate just how surreal this moment was in the halls of power. Imagine a delegation of farmers walking into a federal ministry and arguing that the only solution to their pest problem was the deployment of rapid-fire automatic weaponry. And imagine the government agreeing. Why did they do it? Why did Sir George Pearce, a seasoned politician, authorize the deployment of the Royal Australian Artillery against wildlife? The answer wasn't just biology, it was politics. You have to remember the mood of the nation. The government was being battered by the press for neglecting the veterans. The soldier settlement scheme was failing, unemployment was skyrocketing, and the public was angry. Pearce saw an opportunity. He wasn't just sending guns, he was sending a message. He wanted to show that the government stood shoulder to shoulder with the diggers. In fact, Pearce was so confident in the propaganda value of this operation that he insisted on sending a cinematographer from Fox Movie Tone News along with the troops. This wasn't supposed to be a war, it was supposed to be a harvest. It was meant to be a morale-boosting spectacle. The might of the Australian Army, easily crushing a primitive nuisance. The terms were drawn up. The military would provide the weapons and the personnel. The Western Australian government would pay for the transport. And the farmers, the very men already drowning in debt, would have to pay for the food, accommodation, and the ammunition used. Even in their rescue, the veterans were being billed. Enter Major G.P.W. Meredith of the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery. He was given command of a small but lethal force. Himself, Sergeant S. McMurray, Gunner J. O'Halloran, and 2 Lewis automatic machine guns. Now, if you know your military history, you know the Lewis gun. It was a beast of a weapon, capable of firing 500 to 600 rounds per minute. It had torn through lines of infantry in the First World War, against flightless birds made of flesh and feathers. The result seemed like a foregone conclusion. They packed 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Do the math. 10,000 rounds for 20,000 birds. The expectation was efficient, brutal, and short. Major Meredith fully expected to simply drive up to the flock, open fire, and massacre the birds in heaps. It was the ultimate expression of industrial arrogance, the belief that technology can simply brute force a solution to nature. In October 1932, the troops boarded the train for Campion. The newspapers went wild. They dubbed it the Emu War. The public cheered. Everyone loved the idea of the army saving the day. But as the train rattled toward the interior, nobody stopped to ask a crucial question. What happens if the birds don't stand still? Major Meredith arrived with his machine guns, his cameraman, and his absolute confidence. He stepped off the train into the red dust, ready to be a hero. But the enemy he found waiting for him was not a mindless mob. The emus had been surviving in this harsh landscape for 80 million years. They were about to teach the Australian Army a very humiliating lesson in tactics. Section 4. The first campaign, Machine Guns versus Guerrilla Birds. The war officially began on November 2nd, 1932. The soldiers spotted a group of about 50 emus near Campion. The locals, eager to help, attempted to herd the birds into a tight kill zone, driving them toward the concealed guns. This was standard farming logic. Sheep and cattle herd easily, but emus are not sheep. As soon as the birds realized they were being pushed, they didn't bunch up. They scattered. They exploded in every direction, running in chaotic zigzag patterns at speeds of up to 30 miles per hour. When the first burst of machine gun fire ripped through the air, the emus were already dissolving into the bush. The Lewis gun, designed to mow down lines of trench-bound soldiers, was useless against targets that refused to stay in formation. The first engagement ended with perhaps a dozen birds dead. The rest vanished. Major Meredith was annoyed, but undeterred. Just bad luck, he likely told himself 2 days later. However, they got what looked like the perfect opportunity. A massive flock of over 1,000 emus was spotted near a dam. This was it. The ambush was set. Meredith ordered his men to hold their fire until the birds were practically on top of them. The tension was palpable. The birds moved closer, closer, and then the signal was given. The gunner pulled the trigger. Bung, 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 glunk, the gun jammed. After only a handful of shots, the weapon failed. The 1,000 birds, realizing the danger, turned and fled before the jam could be cleared. It was a fiasco. The technologically superior force had been defeated by a mechanical error and the sheer speed of the enemy. As the days went on, Meredith began to realize something disturbing about his opponent. The emus were adapting. They weren't just running blindly anymore. Meredith noted in his official report that each mob appeared to have a leader, a large, dark-plumed bird that would stand watch while the others ate. At the first sign of the truck or the soldiers, this sentry would signal a warning, and the flock would disperse into smaller groups, making them impossible to target en masse. It was guerrilla warfare. The emus were using the terrain, splitting their forces, and retreating before the heavy weapons could be brought to bear. Frustrated, Meredith decided to change tactics. If the birds were too fast for the gunners on foot, he would mount the machine gun on a truck. He would chase them down. It seemed like a brilliant idea, Mad Max-style pursuit across the outback. But they forgot one thing: the terrain. The ground was rough, bumpy, and uneven. As the truck roared after the birds, it bounced so violently that the gunner couldn't aim. He was holding on for dear life, spraying bullets into the sky and the dirt, hitting absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, the emus, perfectly evolved for this exact landscape, easily outran the vehicle. In one instance, an emu even got tangled in the truck's steering gear, causing the vehicle to crash through a fence. By November 8th, 6 days into the operation, the statistics were humiliating. They had fired 2,500 rounds of ammunition. The confirmed body count, maybe 50 birds. Other reports said 200. Regardless, it was a colossal failure. The press, which had cheered them on, turned savage. One politician asked in Parliament if a medal would be struck for the war, and if so, should it be pinned on the emus. Under intense public ridicule, the Minister of Defence recalled the troops. The emus had won the first round. The Australian army retreated in disgrace, but the farmers were still desperate, and the birds were still eating. Section 5. Retreat, regroup, and the second offensive. For 4 days, the wheat fields of Campion fell silent, or at least, the gunfire did. The sound of crunching beaks and tearing stalks, however, was louder than ever. The army had packed up and left, but the emus remained. The withdrawal of the military might have stopped the bad press in the cities, but out in the dust, it left the farmers in a state of panic. They watched as the birds resumed their destruction with renewed vigor, almost as if they knew that danger had passed. The farmers were furious. They bombarded the Premier of Western Australia with telegrams. They argued that the army had given up too easily, that the tactics had been wrong, and that if the government abandoned them now, the entire wheat harvest and the region's economy would collapse. The pressure worked. The humiliation of the first failure was outweighed by the desperation of the looming economic disaster. On November 12th, less than a week after retreating, the Minister of Defence approved a second campaign. Major Meredith was sent back to the front. But this time, the mood was different. The Fox movie-tone cameraman was gone. The crowds cheering at the train station were gone. There was no glory in this return. It was a grim, pragmatic mission to finish a job that had started as a farce. Meredith, to his credit, had learned from his defeat. He realized that trying to chase emus in a bouncing truck was a fool's errand. He abandoned the light cavalry tactics and switched to guerrilla ambushes. He understood now that he wasn't fighting a conventional enemy. He was fighting a fluid, mobile force that knew the terrain better than he did. The soldiers stopped trying to herd the birds. Instead, they hid near the water sources and the fence. They waited in the blistering heat, sometimes for hours, for the mobs to approach. When the birds came into range, the gunners opened fire, but this time they were more disciplined. They focused on smaller groups. They controlled their bursts. Slowly, brutally, the numbers began to climb. By early December, they were claiming about 100 kills a week. It was a slow, grinding war of attrition. The army reported a final tally of 986 kills, with exactly 9,860 rounds fired, 10 bullets for every bird. And the farmers claimed that perhaps another 2,500 had died later from injuries. But it was during this second offensive that the soldiers developed a begrudging, almost mystical respect for their enemy. You see, killing an emu turned out to be shockingly difficult. These birds possess a physiology that seemed alien to the military men. They have massive layers of dense muscle and feathers that act almost like natural body armor. Major Meredith was astounded. He watched birds take multiple heavy-caliber rounds and keep running at full speed. He later gave an interview that sounds less like a military report and more like a mythological retelling. He said, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks." Think about that comparison. A major in the Royal Australian Artillery comparing a flightless bird to a tank. It speaks to the psychological impact of the campaign. The soldiers were exhausted, their weapons were hot, and the ground was littered with casings, yet the enemy seemed endless. By December 10th, the ammunition ran out again. Meredith was recalled. The government declared victory, citing the numbers, but everyone involved knew the truth. Section 6. The aftermath. A defeat for man, a victory for nature. The machine guns went back to the armory. The soldiers went back to their barracks, and the farmers, they went back to the exact same nightmare they had started with. The Great Emu War has gone down in history as a comedic quirky footnote that makes for great internet memes, but for the people living through it, the conclusion was bitter. In 1934, 1943, and again in 1948, the wheat growers petitioned the government to send the army back. They begged for the machine guns, but the government had learned its lesson. The embarrassment had been too public, the results too pathetic. Each time, the request was denied. Instead, the government shifted tactics. They realized that a centralized, top-down military operation was useless against a decentralized, mobile enemy. So, they switched to an economic model. They instituted a bounty system. Instead of paying a major to spray bullets into the bush, they offered civilians a cash reward for every emu beak they turned in. The difference in efficiency was staggering. In the 6 months of 1934 alone, bounty hunters claimed 57,034 kills. Compare that to the Army's 986. It turned out that a local farmer with a single rifle, motivated by survival and a cash reward, was infinitely more lethal than a government-funded military unit. It was a grim, bloody solution, but it worked where the Lewis guns had failed. They built the state barrier fence, hundreds of miles of fencing that physically separated the agricultural lands from the wild interior. It was an admission of defeat. We couldn't conquer the emu. We could only wall ourselves off from it. So, what is the legacy of this strange conflict? Why do we still talk about it nearly a century later? It's not just because it's funny to think of soldiers losing to birds. It's because the Emu War is a perfect parable for human hubris. It represents that specific 20th century arrogance, the belief that with enough industry, enough gunpowder, and enough machinery, we can force nature to bend to our will. We looked at an ancient landscape, carved it up into square grids, planted foreign crops, and then acted surprised when the native ecosystem pushed back. The emu didn't fight with strategy or malice. It simply existed. It followed the water. It followed the food. Today, the emu still roams the outback. It remains on the Australian coat of arms, standing opposite the kangaroo. There is a saying that both animals were chosen because neither can walk backward, they can only move forward. The emu proved that in 1932. It moved forward through the fences, through the wheat, and through the machine gun fire. The Empire brought its deadliest weapons to Western Australia. expecting a slaughter. Instead, they found an opponent that refused to play by the rules of war. The humans retreated, the birds remained, and if you drive out to the wheat belt today, you can still see them tall, prehistoric, and utterly unbothered. The undisputed victors of the only war Australia ever lost on its own soil. Conclusion: the Great Emu War stands as one of those rare moments in history where reality is stranger than any fiction we could write. It is a story that begins with the tragedy of the Great Depression and ends with the absurdity of a major surrendering to a bird. But beneath the memes and the jokes, it serves as a humbling reminder: we live on this planet, we do not own it. The emus didn't know they were at war. They were just surviving. And in their survival, they outlasted the Lewis guns, the politicians, and the fences. I want to turn this over to you now. Do you think the government had any other choice, given the desperation of the veterans? Or was this campaign doomed from the start by sheer arrogance? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read all of them. If you found value in this story and want to see more documentaries uncovering the forgotten and bizarre chapters of our past, please hit the like button and subscribe. It helps us keep these stories alive. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.